216 BC, the Battle of Cannae, the worst military disaster in Roman history. Hannibal's Carthaginian army has just annihilated a Roman force of 80,000 men. Estimates suggest between 50 to 70,000 Romans were killed in a single afternoon. Senators, tribunes, the cream of Rome's aristocracy, so many nobles dead that Hannibal's men collect over 200 gold rings, stripped from the fingers of Roman aristocrats. Rings that would later be poured out before the Carthaginian Senate as proof of the victory's scale. The city of Rome is in panic. The treasury is nearly empty. The army is destroyed. Hannibal is marching toward the gates. This should be the end. This is how empires die. Overwhelming defeat, depleted finances, no army, no money, no hope. But then something remarkable happens. Instead of suing for peace, instead of accepting terms, instead of doing what any rational government would do when faced with total military and financial collapse, Rome doubles down. Wealthy citizens start arriving at the treasury, not to flee, not to save their fortunes, but to offer contracts. Companies of businessmen called Publicani step forward. They make an extraordinary proposal. We'll fund the war. We'll supply the army. We'll advance the money the state doesn't have. We'll collect taxes from provinces you don't even control yet. Just give us the contracts. Just guarantee us the future revenue. Just promise us that when Rome wins, we get paid. And Rome accepts. Because the Publicani aren't just offering money. They're offering a mechanism. A way to turn future conquest into present financing. A system that would allow Rome to fight wars it couldn't afford. To expand beyond what its treasury could support. To build an empire not on gold in the vaults, but on debt backed by the promise of victory. This is the story of how Rome financed endless warfare, not through taxation alone, not through plunder alone, but through a sophisticated financial system that turned war into an investment opportunity. A system so effective, so profitable, so deeply embedded in Roman society that it sustained centuries of conquest. Until it couldn't, until the contradictions became too great, until the machine broke. How do you finance 400 years of continuous warfare? That's not a theoretical question. That's the actual problem Rome faced. From the Punic Wars in the 3rd century BC to the height of imperial expansion under Trajan in the 2nd century AD, Rome was almost constantly at war, conquering Carthage, conquering Greece, conquering Spain, conquering Gaul, conquering Britain, conquering Germany, conquering Dacia, conquering Mesopotamia, an endless cycle of military campaigns. And wars are expensive. Incredibly expensive. You need weapons, armor, siege equipment, ships, supplies, food, pay for the soldiers, compensation for widows, rewards for veterans, infrastructure, roads, fortifications, garrisons. The costs multiply faster than plunder can cover them. In the early days of the Republic, Rome financed wars through a direct tax on citizens called the tributum. Simple system. The state determines how much money it needs for a campaign, divides that amount among Roman citizens based on their assessed wealth, collects taxes, funds the war. If Rome wins and captures enough loot, the tributum is refunded. If Rome loses, citizens eat the loss. But there's a problem with this system. It only works for short campaigns, quick victories, wars where the plunder comes back fast enough to repay the tax. It doesn't work for long, grinding conflicts. It doesn't work for overseas campaigns where the costs are high and the payoff uncertain. It doesn't work for building an empire. So, Rome needed something different, something more sophisticated, something that could generate massive amounts of capital without immediately squeezing citizens to the breaking point, something that could finance wars before the revenue from those wars existed. They needed the Publicani. The Publicani system didn't start as war financing. It started as a solution to a bureaucratic problem. The Roman state needed things done, roads built, temples constructed, supplies delivered, taxes collected. But the Roman government, even at its height, was tiny by modern standards. A civil service, roughly the size of a medium-sized city government, trying to administer an empire of 30 million people. The solution was privatization. The state would auction off contracts for public works and services. Private companies would bid. Lowest bidder wins for construction projects. Highest bidder wins for tax collection contracts. The company puts up the money up front, does the work, collects the revenue, keeps anything over their bid as profit. Brilliant system. The state gets immediate cash, gets the work done, doesn't need to build a massive bureaucracy. And if the contractor fails, that's their problem, not the state's problem. Risk is privatized. Revenue is guaranteed. These contractors were called Publicani, and they weren't individuals. They were sophisticated corporate entities called Societates Publicanorum, joint stock companies, multiple investors pooling capital, sharing risk, dividing profits. Some of these companies had hundreds of shareholders. They issued shares that could be traded. They had professional managers. They maintained networks across the Mediterranean. Think about what this means. Rome in the 3rd century BC had a developed capital market, corporate entities, tradable securities, separated ownership from management. This wasn't medieval feudalism. This was recognizably modern finance. 2,000 years before the East India Company, 2,000 years before Wall Street. And these companies were run by the equestrian class, the equites, wealthy Romans, just below the senatorial aristocracy, men who had money but were excluded from the highest political offices. Senators were legally prohibited from engaging in commerce. It was considered beneath their dignity. But equites had no such restriction. They could accumulate wealth through business, through contracts, through tax farming. This created a structural division in Roman society. Senators had political power, but were supposed to stay out of commerce. Equites had economic power, but were locked out of the highest offices. The senators made decisions about war and policy. The equites financed those decisions and made them possible. Each class needed the other. Each class resented the other. The tension was baked into the system, and when Rome started expanding aggressively in the 3rd century BC, conquering Carthage, conquering the Greek city-states, conquering Spain, the Publicani became essential. Because now, Rome wasn't just building roads and collecting modest taxes. Rome was trying to extract resources from vast new territories. Provinces that didn't have Roman currency, that didn't have Roman administrative structures, that were hostile and unstable. The state couldn't do this directly. They didn't have the personnel, didn't have the infrastructure. So they auctioned off tax collection rights, province by province. The Publicani would bid for the right to collect all taxes in a region for a 5-year period. They'd pay the bid amount to Rome up front, then spend 5 years extracting every denarius they could from the province. Anything over the bid was theirs to keep, plus interest from the state on the upfront payment. Think about the incentives this created. The Publicani had every reason to squeeze the provinces as hard as possible, to collect more than their bid, to maximize the spread, and they had 5 years to do it before the contract came up for auction again. No long-term interest in sustainable taxation, no concern for local economic development, just extraction, maximum extraction. And here's where it connects to war financing. The Publicani didn't just collect taxes from existing provinces, they financed the conquest of new provinces. Because they could see the opportunity. A military campaign would cost money up front, but if Rome won, there would be a new province to tax, new revenue streams to auction off, new contracts to bid on. The Publicani would loan money to the state to fund the campaign, then bid on the contracts for the newly conquered territory. They were financing both the cost of conquest and profiting from the result. By the 2nd century BC, this system was operating at massive scale. The conquest of Macedonia in 168 BC brought enormous wealth to Rome. So much silver from the mines of Macedonia that Rome stopped collecting the tributum from its own citizens entirely. No more direct tax on Romans. From 167 BC forward, Roman citizens didn't pay direct taxes to fund wars. The provinces paid, through the Publicani. This fundamentally changed the political economy of Roman warfare. Roman citizens now had no financial skin in the game. Wars didn't cost them anything directly. If anything, wars benefited them. More conquest meant more plunder. More provinces meant more tax revenue flowing back to Rome. More opportunities for land distribution to veterans. More slaves to work Italian estates. War became a profit center. And the Publicani were right in the middle, financing campaigns, collecting taxes, supplying armies, providing credit, managing public works. They became indispensable, the financial infrastructure that made empire possible. But the system had problems. Big problems, because the Publicani were ruthless. They had to be. Their shareholders expected returns. Their competitors were aggressive. The contracts were competitive. So they squeezed the provinces mercilessly. Tax collection in the provinces became legalized extortion. The Publicani would assess taxes arbitrarily, demand payments in cash even when the local economy ran on barter, charge interest rates of 4% per month or more, 50% annually. If you couldn't pay, they'd seize your land, your goods, your labor. They operated like loan sharks with the backing of Roman law. Cicero, writing in the 1st century BC, describes the situation in the province of Asia, modern-day Turkey, as one of the richest provinces in the empire and one of the most brutally exploited. Cicero notes that entire cities were falling into debt to the Publicani, municipal governments borrowing at ruinous rates just to pay their tax obligations, the provincial elites being driven to bankruptcy. The locals so desperate, they were selling their children into slavery to pay Roman taxes. And the provincial governors? The ones supposed to protect the provincials from abuse. They were colluding with the Publicani, taking bribes, getting cut into the profits, using their political power to enforce collection. The whole system was corrupt, top to bottom. This created resentment, deep, burning resentment. In 88 BC, when King Mithridates of Pontus invaded the Roman province of Asia, the locals welcomed him as a liberator. He ordered the execution of all Romans and Italians in Asia. 80,000 people slaughtered in a single day. Merchants, tax collectors, Publicani agents, Roman citizens and their families. The provincials carried out the massacre willingly, eagerly. That's how much they hated Roman tax collection. But Rome's response wasn't to reform the system. It was to reconquer the province and reimpose the Publicani, because the state needed the revenue. The Publicani had political connections. They were shareholders in the companies that funded Roman politics. Senators might be prohibited from commercial activity, but they could own shares in Societates Publicanorum. They profited from the system. They protected it. Here's what almost nobody understood at the time. The Publicani system wasn't just about collecting existing revenue. It was about creating future revenue streams and borrowing against them. It was debt-financed imperialism. The Publicani would advance money to the Roman state based on anticipated tax collections from provinces that hadn't even been conquered yet. When Julius Caesar launched his conquest of Gaul in 58 BC, he was funding it partially through contracts with Publicani, who were betting on future Gallic tax revenue. They were financing the war in exchange for the right to exploit the region once conquered. Caesar got the money to pay his legions. The Publicani got Gaul. This created a perpetual motion machine. More conquest generated more contracts. More contracts generated more capital for conquest. More capital made more conquest possible. The system was self-reinforcing. As long as Rome kept winning, as long as new provinces kept getting added, as long as there were new territories to exploit. But there's a problem with any system based on continuous expansion. Eventually, you run out of places to expand into. You hit geographic limits, military limits, administrative limits. And when expansion slows, when new conquests stop generating enough revenue to justify the costs, the whole financial structure starts to crack. By the late Republic, the cracks were visible. Wars were getting more expensive. Campaigns were lasting longer. The easy conquests were done. What remained were difficult, dangerous, costly frontiers. Germany, Britain, Parthia. These weren't wealthy, civilized regions with existing tax infrastructure. These were barbarian territories, low population density, subsistence economies, high military costs, low revenue potential. At the same time, the Publicani were getting more aggressive, more corrupt, more hated. Provincial revolts were becoming common. Governors were being prosecuted for extortion, though usually unsuccessfully because the Publicani had too much political influence. The system was straining, visibly. And then came the civil wars. Caesar versus Pompey, Octavian versus Antony, decades of internal conflict. Armies fighting armies, Roman legions destroying each other, and the Publicani were financing both sides, lending to whoever would guarantee their contracts. Playing on all sides, profiting from chaos. Augustus, when he finally consolidated power in 27 BC, faced a choice. He could continue the old system, let the Publicani keep operating, keep the corruption, keep the instability, or he could reform it, centralize it, bring tax collection under direct imperial control. He chose reform, gradually, carefully, over decades. Augustus conducted censuses across the empire, established fixed tax rates, created a professional bureaucracy to collect taxes directly, limited the role of Publicani to minor functions, customs duties, some public works. But the major revenue streams, the provincial taxes, those came under direct imperial administration. And it worked. Tax collection became more predictable, less corrupt, more efficient. Provincial revenues increased even as the burden on individual taxpayers decreased. Because the Publicani had been skimming so much, their profit margins were so wide that the state could collect more while charging less. But this reform came at a cost. The old republican system, for all its flaws, had created a separation between the state and finance. The Publicani were private entities. If they failed, if a tax contract went bad, that was their problem. The state was insulated. But now, under Augustus, the state was directly responsible. If tax revenues fell short, if a province couldn't pay, the imperial treasury ate the loss. This made the empire more stable in the short term, but more fragile in the long term, because now the state needed continuous revenue, needed to maintain tax flows, couldn't afford provinces to collapse economically, had to spend money maintaining the provinces to keep the taxes flowing. The costs of administration went up, the flexibility went down. By the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire was facing a financial crisis. The old conquest machine had stopped, the borders were fixed, no new provinces, no new revenue streams, but the costs kept growing. Larger armies to defend, longer frontiers, more bureaucracy to administer the empire, inflation eating away at the value of tax revenues, debased coinage, destroying confidence in the currency. Emperor Diocletian, ruling from 284 to 305 AD, tried desperate reforms, price controls, massive tax increases, forced labor. He reinstated direct taxation on Italian landowners for the first time in 400 years. Italians had been exempted since 167 BC. Now, facing fiscal collapse, Diocletian had no choice. The privileged heartland had to pay. He also standardized taxes across the empire. Everyone paid the same rates on land. Everyone paid the same poll tax. No exceptions, no special deals. It was brutal, but it was necessary. Because the old system, the system that had financed centuries of conquest through privatized extraction, had collapsed. The irony is perfect. Rome built an empire using the Publicani system, private contractors financing conquest through tax farming. But that system created so much instability, so much corruption, so much resentment, that it had to be replaced. And when it was replaced with direct imperial control, the state took on costs it couldn't sustain, costs that eventually contributed to the empire's fragmentation. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire couldn't pay its armies, couldn't maintain its infrastructure, couldn't collect enough taxes to function. German tribes weren't conquering Rome. They were being hired as mercenaries because Rome couldn't afford to recruit its own soldiers. And then those mercenaries realized they didn't need to wait for payment. They could just take the provinces. The Publicani had long since disappeared. But the financial logic they represented, the idea that you could finance empire through future revenue, that you could borrow against conquest, that you could sustain endless warfare through clever financial engineering, that logic was embedded in Roman thinking, right up until the system collapsed. We like to think we're different, that modern finance is more sophisticated, more regulated, more stable than the corrupt Publicani of ancient Rome, but the parallels are impossible to ignore. Private military contractors, companies like Blackwater, now Academy, KBR, DynCorp, they're not that different from Publicani supplying Roman legions. They bid on government contracts, advance resources, profit from conflict. They're essential to modern warfare, just like Publicani were essential to Roman warfare. Tax farming might seem like an ancient practice, but think about how many modern governments outsource tax collection to private firms. How many states hire private companies to collect tolls, manage parking enforcement, and run red light cameras? It's the same principle. The state auctions off the right to extract revenue. The company keeps the surplus, and the fundamental mechanism, borrowing against future revenue to finance present conflicts. That's exactly how modern wars are funded. Iraq and Afghanistan cost $7 trillion. Almost none of that was paid for with current taxes. It was borrowed, added to the national debt. Treasury bonds sold to investors betting on future American tax revenue. The Publicani would understand this perfectly. The difference is scale and sophistication. The Publicani operated on millions of denarii. Modern defense contractors and sovereign debt markets operate on trillions of dollars. The Publicani had networks across the Mediterranean. Modern finance has networks across the planet. But the logic is identical. Use future revenue to finance present expansion. Make war profitable for the right people. Create a financial class whose interests depend on continued conflict. Rome's system worked for centuries, until it didn't, until the expansion stopped, until the provinces were exhausted, until the contradictions became unsustainable. And then it collapsed, not suddenly, gradually. A slow dissolution as the financial machinery seized up and could no longer fund the military machine. We should pay attention to that, because our system is built on the same foundations: debt financing, privatized profit, socialized risk, wars funded by borrowing against future prosperity. It works until the growth stops, until the debt becomes too large, until the system can't sustain itself anymore. But here's the twist that historians often miss. The Publicani didn't just finance Roman expansion, they changed Roman society fundamentally. Because once you create a class of people whose wealth depends on conquest, whose businesses require continuous warfare to remain profitable, you've created a political constituency for endless conflict. The equestrian class, the Publicani, they weren't just passive actors, they were political players. They couldn't hold the highest offices, but they could influence who did. They could fund political campaigns. They could bribe officials. They could organize voting blocks. And they used that power to push for policies that benefited them. More wars, more provinces, more tax farming contracts. The late Roman Republic was dominated by factional conflicts between different political groups. But underlying those conflicts was a consistent pattern. The groups backed by Publicani money pushed for aggressive expansion, supported generals who promised new conquests, opposed peace treaties that would end revenue opportunities. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, slaughtering an estimated 1 million Gauls and enslaving another million, he wasn't just seeking military glory. He was opening up a massive new territory for exploitation, for tax farming, for contracts. The Publicani who financed his campaigns made enormous returns, and Caesar used that money to buy political support back in Rome. This created a feedback loop. Military success brought wealth. Wealth brought political power. Political power enabled more military campaigns, which brought more wealth. The system was self-perpetuating, and anyone who opposed it, who argued for peace, for consolidation, for focusing on internal development instead of external conquest, they were fighting against the richest, most powerful political faction in Rome. Even after Augustus reformed the system, even after direct tax farming was curtailed, the legacy remained. The imperial bureaucracy that replaced the Publicani was staffed largely by former equestrians, men who had grown up in the old system, who understood its logic, who maintained its priorities. The institutional culture persisted even as the institutional form changed. And here's what should really concern us. The same dynamic exists today. Defense contractors, private equity firms, financial institutions that profit from government spending on war. They're not just passive recipients of contracts, they're active political players. They lobby, they donate to campaigns, they fund think tanks that push for aggressive foreign policy. They create a constituency for conflict. When a defense contractor employs workers in 40 states, cutting their budget isn't just an economic decision, it's political suicide for the representatives from those states. When financial institutions hold trillions in government debt, default isn't just a policy option, it's an existential threat to the entire financial system. The structure creates its own constituencies, builds its own defenses, becomes very hard to change. Rome discovered this. Augustus could reform tax collection, but he couldn't eliminate the underlying dynamic. The empire still needed revenue, still needed to maintain its frontiers, still needed to keep the military satisfied. The financial pressures that had driven the Publicani system didn't disappear, they just took new forms. And eventually, those pressures broke the empire. Not in one dramatic collapse, but in a slow, grinding dissolution. Provinces breaking away, frontiers contracting, tax revenues declining, the machinery of empire gradually grinding to a halt because it couldn't be sustained financially. From the disaster at Cannae to the final dissolution of the Western Empire, Rome's story is a story of financial innovation and financial collapse. The Publicani weren't just tax collectors. They were the architects of a system that made empire possible. That turned conquest into an investment opportunity. That allowed Rome to fight wars it couldn't afford through the clever manipulation of debt and future revenue. For centuries, it worked brilliantly. Rome expanded. The Publicani profited. The state got the resources it needed. The citizens got the benefits of empire without paying the costs directly. It was genius. A self-sustaining machine for perpetual conquest. But like all machines built on expansion, it had a fatal flaw. It couldn't stop. It couldn't consolidate. It couldn't exist in equilibrium. It needed continuous growth, continuous new territories, continuous new revenue streams, and when those stopped, when Rome hit the limits of practical expansion, the financial structure began to crack. The reforms of Augustus tried to fix it. Centralized control, professional bureaucracy, direct taxation, more efficiency, less corruption. And it worked. For a while, but it just shifted the problem. Now the state was directly exposed to all the risks the Publicani had previously borne. And over time, those risks accumulated until they became unsustainable. The lesson isn't that financial innovation is bad. The Publicani system was remarkably sophisticated, incredibly effective. It achieved things that would have been impossible otherwise. The lesson is that any financial system built on perpetual expansion will eventually fail, because perpetual expansion is impossible. Eventually, you hit limits, geographic limits, economic limits, political limits. And when you do, the system has to transform or collapse. We're running a similar experiment today, using debt to finance military spending, using future revenue to pay for present conflicts, creating constituencies whose prosperity depends on continued defense spending, building financial structures that assume endless growth. The Romans did this for 400 years before the system broke. How long can we do it? Because the thing about Roman history is that they didn't see it coming. Each generation thought they were managing fine. The Publicani thought their system was sustainable. Augustus thought his reforms fixed the problems. Diocletian thought his emergency measures would stabilize things. They were all wrong. The collapse came anyway, just slower than anyone expected. Financial systems that fund wars create their own momentum, their own constituencies, their own logic. They become hard to change because too many people benefit from them, too many institutions depend on them, too much political power is organized around them, until one day they can't be sustained anymore. And by then, it's too late to reform. You can only manage the collapse. Rome financed endless wars through brilliant financial engineering, through the Publicani, through tax farming, through borrowing against future conquest. It worked until it didn't. And when it stopped working, 400 years of accumulated contradictions came due all at once. We should remember that, because we're not that different. Our methods are more sophisticated. Our numbers are larger. But the fundamental logic is the same, and history suggests that logic has an expiration date. The only question is when it arrives. If you found this video valuable, hit the like button, share the video, and subscribe, because the next video is going to be even deeper. Remember, Rome didn't fall because of barbarians. Rome fell because it built a financial system that required endless conquest. And endless conquest is impossible. Eventually, the bills come due, even for empires. Click the next video for another deep exposition. Thanks for watching.